What is up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of the Touchline Talk Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the content I put out on YouTube every single week. Plenty to get to in this edition. Going to do some reaction to what has happened so far in the Premier League season, early lessons that have been learned, and then talk about some of the other major developments over the past week. John Herdman leaving to take the Toronto FC job, Romelu Lukaku headed to Roma on loan, and the first U.S. men's national team roster under Greg Berhalter was released. To begin, though, I want to just take a look at some of the biggest conclusions, interesting developments, takeaways from the Premier League season so far. And I've broken this down into kind of four main categories that I want to talk about. The first of which is the title race. I mentioned this in my weekend roundup. Check out that video if you haven't seen it yet, but I want to expand on it here and kind of go into more detail. Part of what made last season interesting was the fact that from this point in the season forward, Manchester City were chasing Arsenal until they ultimately, caught them and went on to win the league. We are now looking at a situation where City are the only perfect team remaining in the league, and you're coming off of a weekend in which Arsenal couldn't get the 3 points in a game they probably should have. Manchester City, not the most convincing performance, had some close calls at the end. Ultimately, they need the goal from Rodri to win the game. Had those results ended differently and those games played out differently, this would have a different feel to it. Not that anything would be decided. Obviously, it's way too early for that. But what it would do is it would keep everybody right there with Manchester City. It makes Arsenal gives Arsenal a couple points of an early advantage instead of having everybody stare up at Manchester City because you're going to expect it's going to be that way the rest of the season. I am a huge proponent, and I've said this before, I'll say it again, in when you are trying to dethrone a favorite, you have got to be the team that is setting the pace. You have got to put the pressure on them and make them keep up with you rather than trying to keep up with them. It's part of the problem that Borussia Dortmund had with Bayern Munich last season. Even as Bayern were slipping up, Dortmund never took complete control. They had control heading into the last game, but they still had to win that game in order to make sure they won the league. It was a back and forth situation rather than what Arsenal did, jumping out to this league and jumping out to that lead and saying, Manchester City, come catch us. So now everybody is going to have to be better than Manchester City over the next 35 games. The longer that reality goes on and Manchester City keeps shortening that time span, the more difficult this gets. I'm not saying anything new here. And so this next month is incredibly, incredibly important because you cannot afford to fall 5, 6, 7, 8 points behind Manchester City. Unless you're expecting to sweep them, I don't see you making those points up. And it doesn't matter what team, Arsenal, Liverpool, Newcastle, United, whoever. So that is my first takeaway here, is that we are already on the verge of this title race kind of going into the uninteresting realm. We're not there yet. One draw is not the end of the world. I've been consistent on that. But these next few weeks are going to be very telling because if that gap grows to 5 points, it's got a very different feel than if Manchester City slip up and 10 games in, there are one or two other teams at least within 2 or 3 points and maybe even tied on points. So it's already made, upped the ante for this next part of the season when typically It's not supposed to be that high stakes this early, but I really do feel like it is. The other part of this, in terms of title contenders, that Liverpool defense, I I've gotten to the point where I just can't buy it. I really want to keep talking myself into this team, and I'm to the point where I can't. As a title contender, there are just too many defensive mistakes. And on top of all of this, keep in mind that these teams are falling behind Manchester City while Kevin De Bruyne is sidelined. And Manchester City are thin. You don't know what kind of reinforcements are going to be there by the end of the January transfer window, which again reinforces the importance of the next month, month and a half of the season. You cannot play catch up when Manchester City hypothetically are going to be getting even better as the season goes on. Now, you don't have Champions League yet, so that's part of it. Maybe you can catch some breaks in the spring if Manchester City make another deep run, but those are my big things with the title race already. Because the question is always, can somebody keep pace with City? I believe there are teams capable, especially if Manchester City have a season like they did last season, where they weren't spectacular by their own incredible standards. But somebody's got to put pressure on them. It's not enough to just hang around, be within 5 points. You have got to make City win every single game the way that Liverpool did those couple seasons. And if they do, you just tip your cap and move on. But we're on the verge of getting to a spot where it's hard to see somebody even being able to do that. We're not there yet, but depending on how the next month, month and a half goes, we might be getting to that point very quickly. Number 2, relegation candidates, the relegation battle. Really, what I want to point out here is that everything that was expected to happen with Luton Town, with Sheffield United, and with Everton is happening. The most surprising thing is that Sheffield United put up a good fight against Manchester City. It's not that these teams have had bad results to begin the season. That is why I am so concerned and view them as the clear 3 frontrunners to get relegated. It's that this is a continuation of what you for Everton, it's a continuation of the last 2 seasons. For Luton Town and Sheffield United, it's validation of what you expected with them coming to the Premier League. Luton Town just don't have the talent. Sheffield United can't score goals. And I'm looking around at the other teams here, and I just don't see many others that I feel are a relegation candidate on the level of these 3 teams. It is looking worse, not better for Everton. I know there have been some investments made in attackers to see if the Everton and Sheffield Uniteds can start putting the ball in the back of the net. I mean, Everton literally have not done that in the Premier League so far. But I'll believe something changes. That's the point I'm at. And really what I'm trying to get at here. Something has to change for these teams to avoid relegation, and I just don't see it. And then you start looking at, okay, so if one of these teams were to survive, who are the other teams that might take their place in the bottom 3? The 2 I'm looking at are Burnley and Bournemouth. I got all the confidence in the world in Vincent Kompany. I really do think Burnley are going to be fine. It's not going to be a terrific season, but I have a hard time seeing them be worse than these 3 teams, because that's all you have to do. You just have to be not as bad as 3 other teams. And Bournemouth, I've got a lot of faith in Iraola. Again, I don't think they're going to have a great season. And maybe Nottingham Forest. But the way Forest have played so far, I'm feeling more and more confident about their ability to avoid the relegation concern altogether. And maybe Wolves. But Wolves have looked pretty good so far. You're seeing Gary O'Neill do something similar to what he did at Bournemouth last season. And you saw these Bournemouth players have a good season last season, and I would argue overachieve, exceed expectations. I'll bet on the team that exceeded expectations rather than the three that are exactly what you expected them to be, at least so far. Maybe something changes over the next 3 months and you got to reevaluate that by Christmas time. I just don't see that being what we're talking about here. So usually those three, first 2, 3 games in the season, I don't like putting a lot of stock in. It's just way too early. But in this case, I'm willing to kind of buy the stock here and say it's not just about the results, as I mentioned before. It's about the fact that you knew these teams needed to do something above what was expected of them, and they have not done that so far. If anything, they have looked worse, I would argue. Maybe not Sheffield United, but certainly Everton and Luton Town's a little tricky because they, difficult games, didn't get to play the third one. The whole home renovation situation. But Sheffield United and Luton Town are the two least talented teams in the league, and that's what it looks like. And Everton have survived relegation by the narrowest of margins the last 2 seasons and have done nothing to improve themselves. I will back Sean Dyche all day. This is not about Sean Dyche. This is about the club, the foundation, the leadership from a technical, big picture standpoint, not just the manager. This has been heading downward and nothing has changed. They look like a championship team right now. I don't see that changing. So, to me, that's my big takeaway here is I think we found our three relegation, at least the favorite. Maybe they don't end up getting relegated, but I expect all of them to be in that 17 to 20 range all season long. Next thing I want to talk about is our new managers in the Big Six clubs. Got Ange Postecoglou at Spurs, Mauricio Pochettino at Chelsea. Spurs are just as fun to watch as I expected them to be, and they look better than I thought they would. I was preaching from the beginning with Postecoglou that you have to give him time. His MO is that he is a long-term builder. He's not necessarily going to come in and fix everything overnight. They're getting results and putting points on the board in a way I didn't necessarily think they would right away. Now, the other part of this that I talked about from the very beginning is exactly what you're seeing and why Postecoglou was a perfect fit for this club. The fans are excited. They believe in him, the vision. They enjoy watching a team that has attacking ambition. All of that negativity, from Mourinho to Nuno to Antonio Conte, is gone. That is the single most appealing part of Postecoglou. That is the first step, I've said this before, to getting Spurs back to playing in a Champions League final, the Champions League final top 4 era, is you got to get rid of the toxicity. Then you start building. And maybe you can't get there with one manager. Maybe it takes a second one. But this is everything I expected from Postecoglou and more. They probably aren't going to keep this up all season long. I still don't think they're a top 4 team. Top 5 team. But that's not what this is about right now. This is about getting the fans back on board, getting people excited, and they are already doing that. The other thing worth mentioning here is that at some point, if this team is going to actually qualify for the Champions League and do more than just have a fine season, Richarlison and Son need to start scoring some goals and put up some numbers. This is just not working from a attacker production standpoint. They are scoring goals. They are finding, they look really good going forward. But you need somebody that's going to go give you 15 goals. Obviously, Son is more than capable of that. But he hasn't been much of a factor so far. And for Charleston, it's just continuation of last season. So maybe the solution is you play Son through the middle, drop Charleston to the bench. But that is the one thing holding this team back right now. That midfield is spectacular, especially once you get Bentancur back. There's a lot to be excited about there. It only matters so much, and it's only going to take you so far if you don't get the production from your goal scorers. That's what this team is missing right now, because obviously that has been Harry Kane. You can just pencil him in for 20 to 30 goals. Somebody needs to fill that gap, and right now, nobody is stepping up. That is the one thing holding Spurs back from being more than just one of those Europa League contender teams for me. Then, on the Chelsea side. Chelsea's only win is at home against Luton Town. There's how the season's going so far. Now, to be fair, it's a draw against Liverpool and a loss at West Ham. West Ham are playing well right now. So, it's not like this is a catastrophic start. But what it does look like, especially outside of the Liverpool game, because there were a lot of positives in that first game under Poch. It looks like a team with a bunch of young players who haven't quite figured it out yet, and a bunch of names that just really don't scare you if you are City, United, Newcastle, Liverpool, Arsenal, even a Brighton. They're all good players. I'm a huge Moises Caicedo guy. Hopefully, Reece James can stay healthy most of the season. And I'm a huge Christopher Nkunku guy. That's when this changes for me, is when Nkunku gets into that lineup. But right now, who are the players that, when you are talking about the best teams in this league, really, truly terrify you on this team? And then there's the other question, which is, what is the plan moving forward? But that's not specific to this season, so I don't really get into that. But it looks like a slightly better version of last season, which is probably what should be expected. There are positive things happening. Poch is making a positive impact. But they're not at a point where they have the talent to compete with the best teams in this league. And I'm struggling to see how they are going to get to that point. Unless they're just going to wait 5 years for all of these guys to get to, 26, 27, 28, 29. And to me, that's just not a way to run a club. I have major questions about what this is going to be long-term under Todd Boehly. But for right now, I thought there was a chance that Poch could kick this thing into gear right away and that you look up and they're a legit Champions League contender. I just don't see that. It is early, and especially this team that's so new, this manager that's new, you got to give him more time even than most other teams. But I haven't seen anything that, again, changes my mind based on what has been presented, what the history is, what the data says. Which is that this team just isn't all that good right now compared to Chelsea teams of years past. That was what it was last season. I need something to change my mind about that, and I haven't seen it yet. I thought maybe after that first game, it was coming, and you would see it in the next few weeks, and that just hasn't happened. Similar theme here with Manchester United and Newcastle. Both of these teams coming off really, really positive seasons where you see the progress being made, you feel good about your managers, about the direction this thing is going. And they look like the exact same teams with the exact same flaws. Outside of Bruno Fernandes's penalty kick, Manchester United have 0 goals from the players I would deem true attackers. Christian Eriksen is not an attacker. It's Eriksen, it's Casemiro, it's Rafael Varane scoring the goals. And yes, that's supposed to be Rasmus Højlund. Maybe he comes in and everything changes. But I can't just assume somebody that young is going to walk into the Premier League and become a 20-goal a season guy. This is the same story. Sometimes it looks great. Sometimes they look awful. They can beat anybody. They're going to score some counterattacking goals. You got to hope Marcus Rashford gets going because he was the one carrying your attack last season. But they just aren't consistent enough from game to game. You haven't seen the progress you would want to under Ten Hag from year 1 to year 2. And that's specifically from a optics, a visual standpoint. They do not look like his Ajax teams. And maybe it just never will. Because he really has bought into the whole transition counterattacking thing. But there just hasn't been that next step in the progression. He made them better, absolutely. And they're just kind of stuck there, it looks like. And then Newcastle, sort of a similar problem. What held this team back last season was the goal scoring. They were fine, but they were not, Manchester City, Arsenal good at scoring goals, which nobody was expecting them to be. That's not a real criticism. It's just where Newcastle were. And so when you go finish in a Champions League spot, the next question is, can you go to the next level and become a title contender? And with the addition of Harvey Barnes, a full, Alexander Isak settled in, and the arrival of Sandro Tonali, I thought there was a possibility that they could score enough goals to get to that 90-ish point range, which at least gives you a chance if City have a down season. I didn't think they were going to do that, but I could see that within the realm of possibility. After these first few games, I see a 80-ish point ceiling for this team. And specifically with what happened against Liverpool. Those are the kind of games that if you are serious about playing with the best in this league, not just the better teams, the very, very best, and competing with them for 38 games, you have to be able to put Liverpool away. You were up a goal and up a man. And outside Miguel Almiron, there was not a lot of ambition out there. And Anthony Gordon was probably their best attacking player on the field. I am not an Anthony Gordon guy. He was really good in that game, though. And then Eddie Howe took him off, and then they didn't do anything in attack. I know, Almiron had forced the really good save, hit the post. Were they unlucky not to get a second goal? Maybe. But when you're playing 11v10, and Van Dijk is the one who gets sent off, and ultimately a player who comes on is, making his Premier League debut at center back, it just isn't good enough to allow Liverpool to stay in the game, to not just smother them for 90 minutes, and then ultimately you concede 2 goals on 2 chances. They have got to be more dynamic in attack if they're going to take that next step. And the other part of this is, after that debut, I thought Sandro Tonali might be the guy to really kind of unlock this for Newcastle. And it hasn't been great since. He's been fine. But all of the incredible stuff he did game 1, you haven't really seen it since. Harvey Barnes I really like Harvey Barnes. Harvey Barnes is not the kind of guy that's going to elevate your attack by himself. He's a nice piece to have. What you need is somebody to make a difference in the midfield and help out Bruno Guimaraes. They bought Tonali to be that guy. Maybe he becomes him over time. But right now, he's not there. And this team isn't there in attack as a result.